Uh, so good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So you have come on a rainy day, and it's enlightening to kind of see your interest in this topic. So today I will be discussing about Sir Daniel Hamilton and his philosophical legacy in Bengal. So Hamilton kind of lived between 1860 to 1939 and was part of the colonial project. But what I'm trying to show through this paper is not taking, sorry, oh, so I'm not trying to take a partisan view about Hamilton's work and his contribution to Bengal and the whole of the South Asia. But it is more of an engagement where I'm trying to understand what people thought about his work and his contribution. So it is more about a kind of people-centric understanding of his legacy. So I will be showing and going through a variety of slides and kind of fieldwork notes and kind of the archival material that I discovered in the field, which kind of gives new information on how the cooperative movement or the welfarist idea that he tried to promote kind of worked or didn't work for the people whom he intended to kind of produce these these kind of projects. So Hamilton was born in Glasgow, in a small island called the Isles of Arran, in 1860. So as a Scottish businessman, he made Bengal his second home. He established a zamindari in Gosaba, where he experimented with programs of rural and social upliftment. He also established a mango plantation, and that is a much lesser known project in a place called Baripada in Orissa, where he kind of bought around 1,200 acres of land from the British Indian government and started this project of mango plantation. So it was very interesting to see this archive of a kind of balance sheet of how much was produced from these estate and where this money went. So it was a very big project. He was a visionary and builder of rural reconstruction program at a time when the Indian national movement was gaining momentum and gave importance to rural upliftment and self-help. Hamilton was brought up in a business family, as I have mentioned, in the Isles of Arran, of the west coast of Scotland. He was sent out to Bombay in 1880 to look after the branch of the mercantile firm called Mackinnon Mackenzie. So if you go to Calcutta today, you'll find a huge mall, in the banks of the river Ganges. So that was the main hub of Mackintosh, company. So it was a huge kind of seafaring trade company. They used to do a lot of trade in the whole of South Asia. He was married to Margaret Elizabeth Hamilton. He became the chief of Mackinnon Mackenzie in Calcutta in the early 20th century. In 1903, he bought land around 9,000 acres in Gosaba and had it reclaimed by felling the woods and raising embankments on the riverside. His involvement with Gosaba was motivated by his desire to improve the living condition of the poverty-stricken people of British India. He introduced the cooperative system in Gosaba and in all of Sundarban, and thus educated the people to share responsibility. That was his kind of motto. He championed the cooperative society in the Sundarban, ran parallel with the growth of the cooperative movement in India. He also established the Cooperative Credit Society with 15 members in the village called Gosaba. He provided the initial capital of rupees 500 for the society to form. And then a nucleus of group was formed as a rural credit society. So he also wanted to kind of end this whole process of money lending and indebtedness. Following this, in 1918, he started a consumers cooperative society. And in 1919, he set up the Central Model Farm to experiment with paddy, vegetables, and fruits. Similarly, a cooperative paddy society was established in 1923. And in 1924, he established the Gosaba Central Cooperative Bank. And finally, in 1927, he established the most important institution, the Jamini rice mill. But besides that, he also introduced monetized economy. He introduced a paper currency, which was very central towards kind of, decentering the importance of moneylenders or middlemen. But this is just the contextual background of what Hamilton did over a period of around 30 to 40 years from 1920 to 1939 when he was alive. Now we will come to the, things that he did. So here are some of the archival photographs that I collected of him and his wife when they went and visited India and stayed in Gosaba for some time, looked at the rural reconstruction program. This is a family record, a book which is written by one of his descendants. So I got in touch with them when I came back to the UK. And it gives a whole history of where he was born, and then he lived in Essex. And from Essex, he went to Balmakara and bought a big stately home in 1918. And here is an epitaph where he was buried at the end. So this just gives a contextual background of his family history. And these are the two kind of, I would say, projects. So his first project was in Gosaba. So there on your right-hand side, you can see the Gosaba Hamilton bungalow. And it's very interesting. The word bungalow came from Bengal, the idea of bungalow, because these were open houses where they had big veranda. And this building was kind of built in a very interesting way. All the wood were sourced from Myanmar, Burma. And you can see the stilted, bottoms, what I can say, the stilted, pillars, which were built to prevent it from getting flooded. So from 1920 to present time, this house has not been affected by cyclone or floods. So the architectural design was so unique that made it to survive for more than around 80 years. And here you can see his stately home in Scotland that he bought in 1918 from the wealth that he generated in India. Now coming to the kind of point that I've already mentioned. So he also kind of engaged with the Indian nationalists, particularly Gandhi, Tagore, and Jagadish Chandra Bose. And you can see in 2017, this statue was created in front of one of the bungalows that he kind of constructed to, welcome Tagore in 1932. And that was a point. That was a point of time when there were a lot of discussions between Tagore and Hamilton to create a model society. And in fact, he proposed the Bolpur Gosaba project, where he kind of initiated this whole movement to kind of create Santiniketan in Gosaba, which Tagore didn't find feasible, and he rejected that idea. So the whole idea of Hamilton was to have a non-exploitative society where people could live free of the zamindars, the kind of middlemen. But what he missed in this whole kind of philosophy was the kind of the society, how the Indian society, or let's say South Asian society, is organized. It has caste hierarchies. So the whole idea of caste was not featuring in his model of development, or you can say his model of progress or improvement. He was also very much influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment, the rational idea of bringing about improvement, about modernity, and he kind of completely ignored the kind of stratification that exists in Bengali society, or for that matter, the whole South Asian society. And that was one of the pitfalls of his understanding of Indian society. So as I've already explained to you, he introduced a lot of innovative things, like he introduced paper currency, he opened up cooperative rice mill, and all these things were kind of, in a way, productive in bringing about a kind of unique social setup. And these are the kind of things that influenced Indian nationalists like like Mahatma Gandhi, who sent his deputy Madhav Desai to kind of inspect the progress that was done in Gosaba. And even Tagore went and visited Gosaba and kind of had a very kind of convivial conversation with him. In fact, Tagore, as people say in the local area, kind of gifted one of the portrait that was developed by Rosenstein to Hamilton. And Hamilton, in the same way, reciprocated. So they were kind of at length kind of discussing how to bring about improvement in rural Bengal. Now, if you go to this picture, it's the picture of the present, the bungalow, the Hamilton bungalow, and you can see that it's still kind of well maintained, and there are a lot of artifacts that are kept inside the bungalow, which are of a lot of interest. And this picture is interesting because this is how the state and the local civil society kind of celebrate his contribution to Gosaba. So these kind of leaflets, or let's say placards, you'll find everywhere in the islands or in the vicinity, where people kind of commemorate his contribution to Gosaba and remember even till this date. Now, if you go to the next picture, this is a kind of how people memorialize Hamilton's contribution. So it's like the Kachari Badi, where the Zamindars used to sit and kind of govern the whole state. Nowadays, it is leased out to the State Bank of India, but we can see on the ground floor the statue of Daniel Hamilton. And this is kind of pictures from inside the building, where you can see the pictures of Hamilton and his wife, and also his other family members. And these are some of the remaining artifacts that he brought from England. Most of the valuable things, according to local people, have been kind of embezzled by the Zamindars and the state officials. So these are some of the remaining things. And this is one of the most important thing that he introduced in around 1936, the paper currency. And he is perhaps the only kind of individual or Zamindar who issued paper currency in the Indian subcontinent. There are hardly many more examples that you can get. It's the state which issues paper currency. So that was very important for him. And if you read this note, this money is being distributed to construct embankments to protect these islands from flooding. So he had a very clear idea that people should kind of expand this island, grow crops, and settle there, particularly landless peasants, people who have been tortured by the Zamindars. And a lot of Adivasis came who took up land in these islands. So it was not only we have landless tenants, but we also had Adivasis who had come from central India and settled in these islands. And here you can see, now I will come to the context, like I interviewed a number of people who kind of were part of the Zamindari. So here is one person, Shubhabidra Pradhan. He is now running a press called Lobonakta for the past 5 decades. And his father was a primary school teacher in Hamilton's Zamindari. And he has got fond memories of how Hamilton kind of worked through the estate. So he, being the privileged person, like they were part of the estate officials, they got a lot of facilities. Like for example, he was telling me about like they had all the streets lighted in the staff colony. So the staff colony was all lighted. They got very good education. In fact, in the 1950s, they imported films from the British Film Institute, and they had imported generators from the United States, which were used to educate the people in the villages. And in one of the archival record that I saw, the education level in the year 1952-53, according to the state education officer, was higher than that was the average of Bengal. So at that point of time, Gosaba was a very vibrant center of a model of rural development. In fact, I had looked at the applications which were made by people from across Bengal to take up teaching position in Gosaba's high school and lower primary school. And these applications were coming from Dhaka, from Calcutta, from different parts of Bengal. But what I found to be of unique interest in all these kind of analysis was that the people who were applying belonged to a particular caste. The people who were applying for official jobs, like for example clerks, teachers, people who were involved in jobs that common people cannot do, like for example tilling the land. So that was very interesting. That analysis is very important as I go forward with this presentation. Here we find poet Mukunda Gayan. So Mukunda Gayan's family moved to Gosaba in 1944, just before the partition of India. So Mukunda Gayan's family kind of exchanged land with another Muslim tenant who had a lot of land. So before India's partition, there was this window where people could exchange land and kind of cross over, because many people anticipated that there will be partition, and before partition takes place, we can kind of exchange land and come back to the country where we belong. So that is what Mukunda Gayan's family did. But once they entered Gosaba, they found that they were in big confrontation with Hamilton's middleman. the Lathials. And who were these Lathials? These were the people who were brought from Uttar Pradesh. People who joined the Hamilton's Zamindari as big men, as kind of people who would kind of control the population when there was disruption in the villages. Because what happened after Hamilton left was the middlemen who became the de facto zamindar of the estate, the people who were running the estate, became exploitative as they were in their previous generation. And a lot of the people who were landless became indebted again. So in order to control them, these Lathials were brought from Uttar Pradesh and they were employed in the Zamindari. And as I showed you the Kashari Badi, that was the center where the Lathials would stay. And they had posts in different mozas, in different villages. And because Mukunda Gayan's brother, who was in the police force in East Pakistan, had retired from there and had come and joined this Zamindari. They were also local Zamindars in the sense that they had lots of land. They were not essentially Zamindars, but they had lots of land. And they were always in contest with Hamilton's estate officials. So here is another narrative of conflict with Hamilton's state officials. But if you look at the wider picture, if you interview even today anybody in Gosaba, they would say that Hamilton was a great person. His ideas were very unique and kind of relevant for their times. But then the people who managed the estates kind of spoiled the whole project. Then I also discussed Hamilton's legacy with fishermen, local villagers who were who are third generation, who had remember the stories of Hamilton from their forefathers. And it's very interesting to know that these two individuals were sharing a story about how when Hamilton used to arrive in Gosaba, he used to arrive in his own boat and with his own staff. And he used to bring bawarchis from the Hindustan Hotel in Calcutta, which is considered to be one of the most important hotels in Calcutta. And he used to have his own fish tank. And he would not allow these people who were non-state officials to come and do fishing in this fish tank. So there was a sense of alienation among people who were living on the surrounding areas, who were tenants, who used to pay rent to Hamilton Estate and were given land to cultivate and settle down there. So these were some of the stories expressed by these individuals who are the descendants of the state. And here is another very important person, Tushar Kanjilal, who runs one of the largest NGO in the whole of Sundarban Delta. So it's called the Tagore Society for Rural Development. And his life began as a person who was protesting against the state. He was a product of the 1960s and 70s when there was a strong left movement in Bengal. And he started this NGO. But interestingly, when I interviewed him, he also followed some of the principles of what Hamilton stood for. But he was very critical about Hamilton's ideals. And he initiated another form of reform in these villages from the 1970s. So these were the different perspectives that I got. And finally we come to painter Kshitiz Vishal. So he's a very interesting personality. So in the 1970s, he was part of the Naxal movement. And soon he got disillusioned with the whole Naxal movement. And he was inspired by one of his tutors to go to Shantiniketan and start modern Bengali fine art. And he did that. And he came back to Gosaba because he's originally from Odisha. He migrated from Odisha, particularly from Mednipur, those areas, to Gosaba. And finally, what he did is he started his own fine art school in Gosaba. And he started this local museum where he tried to trace the history of the Sundarban, right from the medieval period. So he has got artifacts which dates back to the 12th, 10th century, particularly manuscripts, and also pottery that he discovered in the local area. But what he has added to this whole legacy in this museum is Hamilton's collection. And that's important to understand because he's talking about an individual who belongs to the 19th century and 20th century. And it's very important to understand how people remember Hamilton's work in the region. And that's why I'm showing you these photographs. And here he's talking about the Gosaba Cooperative Bhandar that was created, some of the photographs that he has collected from the state officials. And interestingly, these photographs were taken in Gosaba by cameramen who were hired from Bombay and other places. And there is a very interesting story and twist to it. There was a Hamilton Cup. And that Hamilton Cup was kind of to celebrate his, birth and death centenary. So all the matches that were played, the football matches, they're clearly documented in the register. And there are also letters and correspondence between different teams coming from different schools when there was a kind of match which was abandoned because of rain. And there are very interesting photographs of these football matches. So all these documents are there in the local archives. This is one photograph that Kshitij Vishal has kind of collected, where he shows the meeting between Tagore and Hamilton, which took place somewhere in the 1930s. And as I was talking about the bust of Rosenstein, that is also there here, which is now kept in a very sacred place in the police station because it's worth $1 million. So if you look at these papers, these estate papers, so there are some estate papers which I discovered, and they are very important estate papers which talk about a variety of things. One of them is about the political protest that people were carrying out in these islands, particularly the rise of the Republican Socialist Party in the 1920s and 30s. How did it come about? So I'll be talking about the role of the three institutions here: the church, the Baptist church, the local peasantry, who found themselves to be very much, kind of annihilated by the Zamindars, who were exploiting them, and also the role of the Zamindars themselves. As I was mentioning to you about the Hamilton Cup, so this is the kind of rusted old cup which is kept in one of the, in the cupboards, which we discovered. If you want to understand the legacy of Hamilton's philosophy, there are contradictions as well as assemblages. So there is a sense of entitlement and despair. By this I mean that if you look at the 1920s and the 1930s, there were a large number of famines in Bengal. And if you read Amartya Sen's work, he talks about how people suffered and why famines happened in Bengal was not because there was lack of food, but because there was no access to money, there was no access to entitlements, and that is why the famine took place. The Churchill government kind of diverted all the food crops that were produced in India for war efforts. So there was no scarcity of food in India. But why it is important? Because Hamilton was trying to create that sense of entitlement for people who were settled in Gosaba by issuing paper currency, by kind of creating cooperative Jamini rice mill, so that people could have access to their produce. So what is also important here is we have to discuss about the middlemen who were appointed by Hamilton, like for example, Sudhanshu Bhushan Majumdar, who was for a long time the manager of the estate. And these people created a kind of smoke screen around both Hamilton as well as the people of Gosaba and the people of India, because they were constantly corresponding with Balmakra. When Hamilton returned back to Balmakra, they were sending these correspondences, and they were always blaming the kind of insurgents as Marxist revolutionaries, as kind of people who would disrupt the good work that Hamilton was carrying out in these islands. So we have figures like Jogan Maiti. Jogan Maiti is a very important revolutionary during this period, who is kind of constantly petitioning, taking out strikes, and interestingly, there was no police station in Gosaba till 1960. So why it didn't happen? Like why it didn't come up after independence? It should have been a police post by 1947. So the whole estate was managed by the Zamindars, particularly people like Sudhanshu Bhushan Majumdar. And in fact, Sudhanshu Bhushan Majumdar writes a very interesting kind of memoir about Hamilton's kind of cooperative work, and I will show you that in the coming slides. And that continues till the 1960s, 70s, up to 80s. So the last person to carry on that legacy was Gopinath Burman, and he was considered a legendary doctor who worked in these islands. But interestingly, his kind of autobiography is written by his daughter, who now lives in the US. So you can see the kind of sense of entitlement that these people had owned, the Zamindars had owned, that this was their estate. So once Hamilton left, they took on the responsibility of running the state, and they became the de facto owners and the beneficiaries of the state's development. So the people for whom Hamilton has kind of intended to bring about improvement, they were left in their own state, like they were poor as they were before. So that is what I'm trying to say. So if you look at this very interesting document, which is called State Farming in India, written by Bhushan Majumdar, and it's published by the Imperial Council of Agricultural Research. So if you read this whole document, there is only kind of praise for Hamilton. But what is important during this period was the case that was raised by Father Masaryk. So this case was enlisted in Bashirhat Court, which is not very far from Gosaba, where Father Masaryk, who belongs to the Catholic denomination, kind of went against the Baptist denomination of CNI, the Churches of North India, of which Hamilton was kind of, was a believer. So what he did, he kind of gathered a lot of people and said that we should now start protesting against the Zamindari because it's exploitative. It no longer follows the principles of Sir Daniel Hamilton. And they filed a petition in the court. But over a period of time, as I was looking in the archives, he was recalled by the Archbishop of Calcutta, and he was told that you are going there to kind of preach the religion, not to do politics. So the case ended. But what I'm trying to say, the significance of how the church and the local zamindars colluded. In fact, after the publication of this article, I found another document which was written by the Baptist Church, and it was kind of trying to defend the zamindars, that whatever they were doing was good for the whole of Gosaba, and that there was no disruption, there was no socialist movement that was taking place, and everything was hunky-dory, like everything was going well. But that was not the case. So if you look at these two documents, so now we come to the 1950s, after India's independence, there was a big fight between the state government and the Hamilton Zamindari, that who would take control over it, because the government has already passed these land acquisition rules, and the zamindars, the middlemen, were in a quandary. They didn't know what they could do with that. So ultimately they took out the legal recourse, and they kind of got the document from Scotland, because there was a will that was written by Hamilton that after my death, my wife will be the owner of this estate, and after her death, some other member of the family will take control over it. But finally it was made into a public trust. So the government was convinced that, well, it's a public trust, it's for the public good, so we did not kind of, take control of this trust. And that is how the zamindars kind of defended their case till the late 1990s, when the estate became part of the government. So now the Deputy Commissioner of Southern River Pargana is the chairman of the whole Gosaba estate. But till the 1990s, that was the case. Now we come to the final slide that I'm going to show. So here we have Gopinath Burman, who was the doctor in 1970s, and kind of he was considered to be one of the most benevolent doctors who worked in that region for a long time, and also was the trustee of the Hamilton Charitable Trust. So what I have tried to kind of highlight in this paper, and what I'm going to try to discuss, is Sir Daniel Hamilton's contribution to life and society in the Sundarban is either critiqued as patronizing and idealist capitalist project far-fetched for his time. While I do not dispute these observations made by nationalist and Marxist scholars within South Asian's academia, I find these observations too simplistic and partisan with strong ideological underpinnings. I propose a more complex understanding of actors and actants who played a key role in materializing Hamilton's plans and programs in Gosaba, the site of Hamilton's experimental cooperative project. My observations and critiques are based on primary sources and participatory interviews with present generation in the island, and who have been part of Hamilton's legacy as benefactors and opponents of Hamilton's officials, particularly the Babus who ruled the estate. I conclude from my ethnographic fieldwork and archival research in Gosaba that Hamilton's idealistic philosophy of alleviating people from poverty and from the grip of moneylenders, middlemen in Bengal, created a civil society that was not opposed to Hamilton's philosophy for Gosaba per se, but the brown babus who belonged to the exploitative upper caste groups. The failing of Hamilton's grand project lay in his failure to grapple with the caste hierarchy and social inequalities in Bengal that he examined only through the prism of economic empowerment. He failed to recognize the historical injustice faced by Dalits and other lower castes in Indian society that did not allow equality for all. Further, Hamilton was highly influenced by Scottish Enlightenment that believed in positivist values and techno-managerial intervention that did not work in Gosaba. The social stratification in Bengali society, the religious sentiments and caste structure within villages, questions of untouchability, purity, and pollution made it increasingly difficult for the outcast to be freeholders of their own land. The leased out land were ultimately taken under control by the landed gentry and the Zamindars, who enjoyed jajmani rights and privileges within Hindu society as moneylenders. Hamilton was aware of this because he had to depend on the Babus of Kolkata, English-educated clerks, to rule his estate. Therefore, his inability to personally supervise his project had trapped him to choose between a rock and a hard place. The Baptist missionaries that I have mentioned sided with the state managers, while the common people were battling for their legitimate rights, the petitions, pamphlets, and strikes. I, in fact, saw many anonymous letters which were written to the Amrit Bazar Patrika, where people had kind of highlighted very clearly that we are very much supportive of Hamilton's ideas and his ideology, but we want to end the exploitative nature of the Zamindars, who were not following his principles. Although they wrote anonymous petitions to leading newspapers, they were quickly countered by state officials and the missionaries, vouching the state officials, branding the troublemakers as communist gangsters. In this fashion, the discourse of benevolence and justice created a small screen for the Babus of the state to implement disseminatory tactics with impunity so that they can profit from the state and build their fortunes back home in Calcutta by acting as de facto owners of the Zamindari and the Hamilton Charitable Trust. After the death of Sir Daniel Hamilton and his wife, Elizabeth Hamilton, the estate rights were transferred to Hamilton's brother-in-law. He visited the island in the 1950s after India's independence and was insulted by the managers of the state.
Own self-interest. And even if you think about the creating a monetary economy, I mean, was that really enlightened self-interest? Because, well, I mean, the barter system, that created community, whereas a money system, as you know, in the system that we have now with the monetary economy, that is creating much more poverty, and much more alienation of the human classes. Yeah. I was sorry to say, but I just got the impression that you were making it out to be something really good, and the real culprits were the brown middle management. But I suppose we're all interested in making a bit of money.
No, what I looked at when I looked at the records, the kind of archives, this is how the middlemen, the appointed clerks and the appointed middlemen worked. They were trying to further their self-interest. Like, for example, Gopinath Barman, who became manager of the state in 1970, that is like post-independence. He was considered to be a well-educated person who lived in these islands, worked among the villagers, but then he sent the whole family to the US. So he was not interested in doing welfare for the people and live there. Like, for example, the current one of the member of the committee, who is a related to Gopinath Barman, and when I interviewed him, he said that these people are poor and because they don't understand what is self-improvement, they can never progress, and he never visits Gosaba. He lives in his hometown in Calcutta, and he said, why should I go there? These people are dirty, they don't understand anything. So I think that perspective is very important to understand, that the people of Gosaba have not done anything wrong. They were landers, they were given land, and they should have got that entitlement. But there were some vested interests who took away those entitlements from them by bringing in the whole money lending system. So from that perspective, Hamilton was not wrong, but you are absolutely right that Hamilton was a product of the Scottish Enlightenment.
No, not the Scottish Enlightenment.
Yeah.
The Scottish Enlightenment was about creating opportunities for all social classes and uplifting the poor.
Yeah.
You know, we had the Industrial Revolution, and it sort of showed the poverty that was in the cities. The people were thrown off the land and told to go and work in the factories. And the Scottish Enlightenment, the philosophers, they saw that and said, this is wrong. But capitalism is that.
So he wanted to create a free society where people could kind of live without the middleman, like for example the Zamindars or the Jodhas, who were kind of manipulating the land revenue system, and they were appropriating the resources from the land. So that was his aim, that was his idealist goal, but it didn't materialize in field because there were other factors which played a very dominant role. And that's why we have the rise of the Republican Socialist Party in the late 1920s. And there were many actors, I just gave one name. And that's why in the late 1950s, the other left-wing political parties didn't have a stronghold. Even up to the 1970s, the RSP had made their ground in the field. So there was a big peasant movement. Like, there was one very interesting movement, just called the Handor Andolan. The weights and measures that were used to kind of weigh the products which were brought to the mills, they were kind of manipulated by the traders, and that led to this movement where people were fighting for just weights. So that led to this movement. So there were so many micro movements that were taking place in the villages, which itself kind of testified to the fact that what Hamilton had planned or kind of proposed in his philosophy was going wrong in the village. Yeah.
I find this discussion extremely interesting. It's full of contradictions. To put Hamilton as the leader of Scottish Reformation or Enlightenment is wrong. He was only a product of it. He lived at the time when Enlightenment was long back over. The only thing that he brought, or that is the main thing, not only thing, that's the main thing, he got from the Scottish movement and brought it to Bengal is this cooperative movement. Now, before him, there were three very important, very famous people from Scotland with the correct, with the right connection to the Scottish movement was David Hare, and the two others I forgot the names. One in the church and one in the educationist. The man who founded the Dharmatal Academy.
David Drummond.
Pardon?
David Drummond.
That's right. It's a crime to forget his name. I'm too old, forgetting everything. And if you think about the other three, then you can understand that they are playing, they are performing a role which was historic. They are doing something which was befitting their time and their origins. But what Hamilton was doing is, to me, something trying to bring to Bengal, which sounds very nice. He was so intentional people, I have no doubt about it. But that was not the thing that Bengal needed at that time. You bring the cooperative movement, where did you get the money from? His money came from Mackinnon and Mackinnon. He was a top man there. And he got all this money and bought huge amount of land. And then, with all his good intentions, he was actually whitewashing feudalism. Because he didn't intend that, but that's how it amounted to. He's trying to defend, he didn't try to defend himself, but his followers were trying to defend and trying to say, well, what a good-hearted man we got. But it was not, Bengal did not need good-hearted man. Bengal needed people who would fight feudalism. Colonialism and feudalism were in nexus. That's the most vicious thing in Bengal. The permanent settlement destroyed Bengal. landlordism was the number one enemy of Bengali people, yeah, and also rest of India. So in that way, he was doing something with all intentions, good intentions, was not something that was really required at that time. It didn't do any good. Yeah, it died a natural death.
Yeah, completely agree to what you have said. That's why I said he was one of the product of Scottish Enlightenment. He was not the kind of epitome, or he was something. And as you have mentioned, there were other people like David Hare and all who also brought in cooperative ideas. But then we find a functional system in operation in Lower Bengal, because these lands were reclaimed from the mangrove forest. Because these lands were not productive. They were reclaimed from the mangrove forest. So if you go to Hingalganj and other places, like we have Tillman Hinkle and other people who did land reclamation program. So he was one of them. So I'm not discounting the fact that he was a capitalist and that he had kind of invested those money into bringing about improvement in the lives of the people. And there were other people who were collaborating with him, like for example, Tagore, Gandhi, and other people. So I completely agree to your point that yes, there is this element of cooperative movement, which there is a nexus between landlordism and capitalism and the colonial empire. So there is no discounting of the fact. What I am trying to highlight through my paper is the fact that Hamilton intentionally or unintentionally undermined the social stratification in Indian society, and that led to the failure of his project, particularly undermining the kind of how Dalits are placed in Indian society, how scheduled caste people are placed in Indian society, how Muslims are placed in Indian society. So that was not taken into cognizance when he was framing his program. He was only looking his project through the prism of economic empowerment. So he was forgetting about social empowerment, he forgot about the cultural empowerment of the people. So that may be intentional, as you mentioned. It can be unintentional effect of this project. So that is what my summary of the project program of his kind of philosophical underpinnings are.
One of the things, sorry, I just sorry. One of the things that is very misleading is to bring this issue of subject of Scottish emancipation movement here, enlightenment here, because the real effect of Scottish enlightenment, which actually created to an extent modern Bengal in the beginning of 19th century. Here, Drummond and who's the other one? Who was the leader of the church? I've forgotten. Anyway,
Bishop Heber.
Pardon?
Bishop Heber.
No.
I've forgotten the name. But anyway, they actually were acting as leaders of the Scottish movement in Bengal. The situation they created, yeah, that is not the only. They are not the only people who actually brought the so-called Bengal Renaissance, but they had a huge contribution in that. If you compare Hamilton with that, is no comparison at all. The two different ages, two different periods. The only link with the Scottish movement I can see is this cooperative movement, which was it was only only an aspect of it. But you cannot give you cannot say that Hamilton is an example of how Scottish the Reformation movement, the Enlightenment movement affected Bengal. That is a wrong example.
Yeah, but
you talk about William Carey, is it? William Carey.
Sorry.
You mean William Carey?
Kelly is also there.
Okay,
yes,
sorry.
yes.
Yeah.
I know there is a
Yes, but I'm not looking Hamilton's contribution from that perspective, or whether he brought Scottish Enlightenment to Bengal or not. I'm looking at it from a completely different perspective, where I'm looking at the kind of local narratives, what people think about his contribution, or his the kind of nostalgia and amnesia that people have about his contribution to that movement. I'm not trying to say that he was the prodigy. He was definitely a prodigy of some kind of work that was going on in Scotland, but I'm not trying to say that he championed it in Bengal. He did champion it, but then that is not my focus of study. My focus of study is to look at the actors and the actors who were part of this whole movement in Gosaba, in and around Gosaba, in those islands which were reclaimed from the sea and made settlements. in the late 19th century, and there were many other settlements which were formed, but I'm only looking at Gosaba. So my focus is not at promoting, or let's say, his philosophy, or let's say his idea. I'm trying to critically engage with his correspondences and his writings that we have got, which have not been kind of looked at because they are not accessible. They're very difficult to get because they're not in the National Archives, or let's say West Bengal State Archives, or for example in the British Library. So I'm trying to engage with those micro discourses.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you, so how did this cooperative exactly work? So is this a closed economy which is functioning in one of the disconnected islands of Sundarbans, or is it like connected to the markets of Calcutta? Because I mean, a similar kind of cooperative was later on in the latter stage of the 20th century also tried by the Left Front government, of which RSP was an affiliate member. Now, I mean, we had cooperative markets at Jadavpur, Goria, where crops which were grown in the Sundarban area, South Bengal deltas would come into Calcutta, and the cooperative would function between these two areas, not as, let's say, the farmers are producing something in, let's say, Gosaba, and they're selling it in Gosaba or in the neighboring villages itself. So it's a closed market. Unlike the, what I'm trying to understand is Hamilton's model, that of a closed economy where you grow the certain crops in a particular land, and you basically the market for that is that particular island or the larger Sundarbans itself, or is there, are these products being transported to Calcutta, which is the main center of colonial market, and from there reaching to a greater customer population? And secondly, how is this different from let's say the self-sustainable models which Gandhi and others are promoting at a certain point of time? Now, in Gandhi's model, for example, caste plays it kind of accommodates the caste hierarchy, and the concepts and ideals of varnashram, that a certain caste of people are entitled to do certain kinds of work, and that's how the society maintains its balance. Yet, as a village, as a producer, as a producing community, as a village, it remains self-sustained and closed. So, two questions. How is it a closed cooperative model, or does this communicate, the Hamilton's cooperative model communicate with, let's say, Calcutta and the bigger market? And two, how is his rural development or model of the self-sustained village different or similar to Gandhi?
Okay, so first of all, these islands that were reclaimed from the sea in the late 1920s, they were not inhabited by indigenous groups. Yeah, there must have been some kind of seafaring community who were trading in that area in the late 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. There were sea pirates, we had mob bandits coming to there. But essentially, people had come from central India who were landlords. People had come from Mednipur, where there were a lot of floods that were taking place in that area, and people had migrated. So they were mostly landless peasants, the most disempowered sections of the society. And they were
that's the composition of the village.
Yes, right. I'm coming to that. So it was a closed economy, as you mentioned. It was not an open economy where people would kind of produce the rice or vegetables or whatever was produced in the village that would be sold in Calcutta or faraway places in the whole of West Bengal or East Bengal. So that was.
Didn't Mackenzie's Island, which was also owned by Mackinnon and Mackenzie after a point of time, had a very big fishery industry from the late 19th century in that area, from where fish would be imported to all other parts of India? Because of course fisheries is still a very mainstay of livelihood back in the Sundarbans, still today. It's one of the main sources.
From the record that I've seen, we don't see any fish production. I mean, there were like around 20,000 pages of record that I've seen. There is no mention about fishery. There is only mention about agriculture. See, there is around 10,000 pages of land dispute records.
Right.
So the Hamilton Zamindars by 1950 had kind of entered into a litigation where they're fighting cases with each other. So that was a major kind of files, court cases files. One, I saw the education department files, where I have mentioned about the kind of things that they were important. Because when I looked at BFI's files, the kind of documentaries that we were sending, I said, why is BFI's file here in the village? So then I got the idea. And there were other things, like for example, recruitment of teachers and kind of building of new settlements. In fact, there were petitions done by East Bengali refugees to settle down. And in fact, Hamilton's Zamindari had given 50 acres of land for East Bengali refugees to settle in that area. Not Hamilton, but Hamilton's Zamindars. So they had created this refugee colony. So all these things were going on. In the 1950s, there was a big tussle between the Congress and the RSP, where the Congress was trying to kind of appease the people who had come from Bangladesh as refugees. And there was a constituency. That's okay. So these files are there, but I am not seeing this fisheries file. In the a lot of the documents were also not missing because the condition in these islands are very poor and they're not managing the archives properly. So, but at least 90% of the records are available. But out of those 90% records, there was no mention about fishery industry, which was kind of developed. So I don't have any knowledge whether fishery. Maybe they did an experimental project with fishery, but there was the Jamini rice mill, and the Jamini rice mill was the center where the Handor Andolan took place, because people were using different weights and measures to kind of cheat the local peasants who were bringing rice to these mills, and that led to this whole movement. And people like Jogan Maiti, who were the tribal leaders, they petitioned against the Zamindari because they were exploited. They were imposed high rates of rent. In fact, even today, like the whole Christian community in Gosaba, they don't have any land, because what has happened is that the land that they got, they lost, because they were put into this whole chain of drinking wine, and they lost money. And the middleman came and kind of, they took away all their land. So in that way, they were again brought back to indebtedness. So the middleman played a very important role in kind of bringing people back to indebtedness, where they lost their land, their possession that they had. And there was high taxation which was going on. And because of this high taxation, and because there were two types of land, one of the private land was one of the state-owned land, and there was this conflict about boundaries, on land boundary conflict, and that led to court cases and filing of cases. And there was some independent lands also. Like, for example, I mentioned on Mukunda, who had exchanged land with another Muslim family who had went to Bangladesh, and they had traditional dispute with boundaries. And these were the kind of conflicts that we could see in the local archives. Yeah.
Okay, how similar or different was it from Gandhi's idea?
Yeah. So Madhav Desai, when he visited in the Gosaba project, he made a comment that you still need to improve the kind of rates you are charging from your tenants. So that was his only comment. And otherwise he kind of appreciated the project. But I don't think Hamilton Zamindari kind of took into consideration the kind of caste hierarchies in West Bengal, or let's say in Gosaba or Lower Bengal. Because most of the people who settled in Gosaba were either immigrants from Mednipur or they had come from East Bengal. And after 1947 and after 1970, most of the refugees who have come from Bengal, who have not gone to either Andaman and Nicobar Islands or Madhya Pradesh or other parts of India, they have settled down in Gosaba. Because of their caste identity crisis, particularly in cities like Calcutta, people do not give their their houses on rent. They will first ask their caste identity. If you say that I am a Dalit, you will not get rent. And there are people who had kind of changed their caste identity. They had changed their caste identity, and now some of the people, lower caste people, have become upper caste people. This is the story of 1940s and 50s, when people were migrating from Bangladesh, and even after 1970s, this was the case. So this is the composition, social composition of people who are living in Gosaba, in these islands, most of them. And the people who were school teachers, like for example, school teachers, or let's say people who had come from the cities, they were from a different class. The whole idea of Bhadralok has two connotations. One is the economic connotation and the social connotation. So that played out very well in this. If you also read Amrejali's book, The Forest of Tigers, you'll find this, the grammar lok and the city people, there's a big distinction.
So how did the lower caste people change their caste identity? How they meant to do that?
No, they did not change their caste identity. That's why they had to kind of move to Sundarbans, where they could kind of mingle with their own fellow men. Like people who had moved from all these coastal districts of Bangladesh, they belonged to the lower caste, and they had moved to another coastal area, because they had been kind of pushed back to Dandakarnia, a place in Odisha, where the government in the 1950s and 60s has created this whole project called Dandakarnia Development Project. And people revolted, and they did get better kind of land. The land was completely arid. And then they moved back to Bengal in the late 1970s.
So then they just lied about their caste identity.
Yes, they did, particularly in Calcutta. People who didn't get the land and they still wanted to. But this was a kind of microscopic minority. It was not the whole population. It was like few families.
So who are the people at the top of the society?
Particularly the Zamindars, the Brahmins, the landlords, like for example, people who own land.
So what is a middleman?
The middleman is a person who has been appointed by the British Indian government. Like when they started this whole, rearrange the whole land structure, they made the Zamindars as the middleman who would collect rent for the colonial state and revenue, and then they can appropriate any amount of tax.
So the Zamindars were originally at the top,
Yeah.
and then when the British Empire came, then they started working for the British Empire.
Yes.
Actually, they were tax collectors.
So
They were tax collectors.
Zamindari came with permanent settlement,
Yeah,
of course.
Zamindari came with the British. They were not existent when the Mughals were there. Like they had other tax collectors, yeah. But when the British came there, they were.
So first they were Mughals, and then they became Zamindars after that.
You're going to get really confused. So the caste system is a form of social hierarchy. In every society we have that. You've got the people at the top with the money, and then you've got the people that will have nothing and do all the work. So we've got that in this country as well. So in Hindu philosophy, you've got the Brahmins who are the priestly caste, like the mullahs, they'll get the top. And then you've got the warriors, the Kshatriya, then the Sudras.
That's the Varna.
Well, the
Yeah,
various
so you have-
caste systems.
Yeah, no, but that's the Varna, the fourfold Varna. Within that you have the Jatis, which were translated as castes. So yeah.
So it depends on what job you do. And you could change, if you went to a different part of the country, you could just pretend that you did a different job. So you could change it.
But wouldn't you get caught because your whole attitude and mannerism and this would kind of reflect the background, the caste background that you come from.
Yes.
It's like class here, if you
Class
if you come from a working class, you can't pretend to be upper class.
No,
Like,
class and caste
completely
are not the
different.
same
Yes.
thing. In Hindu, I was born in a Hindu family. The caste system is so rigid that you are born into a caste
Yes.
and you cannot change your caste. The only way I liberated myself saying that I'm not a bloody Hindu. I
No,
don't
but
believe in
no.
any religion. I think time has come to say goodbye to it.
But if you're an Indian, if you're anybody that's connected to India, we all have caste, whether you're Hindu, Muslim, Sikhs, Christian. We're all affected by
Yes.
the caste that we were born into. And you may want to change it, but the only way you can change it is by migrating to somewhere else where nobody knows you, and then you can become whatever you want to be.
Yeah, and consequently, the history shows that lower caste migrated the most in retro-medieval India.
So say that again?
Well, the lower caste normally displayed tendencies across the historical timelines of migrating more than the upper castes.
And that makes sense, though, doesn't
Yes,
it?
because the upper castes were landed.
Migration
But
is
also we have, everything is in their favour. It's always the poor that want to move to better themselves.
migration is not going to solve the caste problem. The caste problem, it is the number one problem in India, and we have to find ways of finishing with it.
Eradicating it, yes.
It's going to be
by running away from
probably
India,
long way off.
might solve my personal problem. I didn't run away from India because I was in the upper caste. But the casteism is a sin, is a torture, is something.
But was
You
the
cannot
caste
live with
system not something that was exacerbated by the British? Because
British
I mean, if you look at in Hindu philosophy with the caste system and how the Varnas were, it makes sense that there are people that think there are more, they use their brain more. There are others that use their strength more.
That's
But-
not how caste system developed.
Yeah, but you can understand how the philosophy started.
That's not how caste system developed. Hindu philosophy is hypocritical.
Let's not go into the focus on the.
Okay.
So Was Zamindar the term for the aristocrats who used to own the land?
Yeah.
Yes. Someone needs land.
Could I just ask a question or clarify something about where the Christian bit fitted into it? You mentioned at one point Baptists, and then you also said Church of North India, but they're not the same church. Baptists is not part of the Church of North India, but who was it that were part of that community? Was it Baptists or Church of North India?
Okay, so there is a CMI church, Churches of
That
North
is
India.
church.
Yeah. So Hamilton was the follower of that church.
Of Church of North.
And the kind of the missionaries who worked for that church and who came from different parts of India
Sure.
were consistently kind of through their pamphlets and their written literature were supporting Hamilton's work and also supporting Sir Daniel Mackinnon and his co-workers. But when because the Catholic Church wanted to create a debate center, Father Meredith was sent, and he kind of took the people together and kind of revolted, like people who were antagonized by the Zamindars because they were kind of expropriating their revenues, and then he filed a case in Bashirat court to kind of get justice for these tenants. And ultimately it fizzled out because the Archbishop said that you have gone there to preach the mission of the gospel and not to kind of revolutionize the whole community. So what I meant is that there were two opposing churches, or let's say denominations, which were fighting for access to get control over it.
Can I ask a different question? So, what part did Hamilton play in the destruction of the Sundarbans and the recent situation of climate change and the sinking of Bangladesh? Or the flooding of Bangladesh?
I think that this whole question boils down to the whole revenue generation politics in Bengal from the late 18th century. So the Bengal presidency, they wanted to kind of generate more revenue. So it was across the Bengal Delta that, because if you look at historically, it is only the Muslim prophets who came to these islands in the late 12th, 13th, 14th century, or if you reach it on, that they kind of, in some ways, kind of influenced people to cultivate. Before that, these areas were kind of covered by forest. They were kind of affected by cyclones and floods. And there is a long history of where people have tried to create settlements in these islands, but they were destroyed because of tsunami and flooding and cyclones. So it was not habitable. So what the British Indian government did, they gave incentives to local zamindars that if you open up land, we would give you some money to kind of create embankments or bunds. And that is how these lands were built. Because if you allow the seawater to come in, you cannot grow anything because the whole land will be salinized. So you have to allow fresh water to come into the islands, and then only these areas can become prosperous. So over a period of time, like when Hamilton opened these islands, it was not done in 1 year. It took at least a decade for this island to be settled. So in the initial years, there was huge kind of problem. Like they had to bring some desalinization plant, and then only people could kind of survive in these areas. Even today, like if you look at people, they don't get very good potable water in these islands. So there is high levels of arsenic that you find in the water. And there are a lot of other problems, medical problems, like commuting between islands is very difficult. It is only in the last 10-20 years that they have built bridges from Kolkata to Gosaba. They have built 2 big bridges which directly connects to the islands. But earlier people would have to spend around 6 to 8 hours to come from Gosaba to Kolkata, which is only 100 kilometers, or even less than 90 kilometers. So that was the kind of situation. So yeah, definitely it is creating huge problem because you have put people in a place where people should not inhabit islands. And that has happened across Bangladesh, across India. So, and also you have put people in conflict. So because there is a tiger reserve, and surrounding the tiger reserve you have got huge settlements of human population, which happened because of this whole colonial project of revenue generation. So you are expanding the rice frontier from the Bengal Delta. You are expanding the rice frontier, and that has been the product. So it has kind of created this problem of climate change and impact on sea level rise and how it is going to affect the islands, and that's why there is this Millennium Development Goals, and they are trying to get in.
But the part that Hamilton played.
Yeah, these are vibrant islands, and they have kind of expanded. In fact, in the 1950s, a lot of these lots were kept for refugees to come and settle. When this Bidhan Chandra Rai, who was the chief minister, and after that, even when Jati Mishra government came, they kept a lot of land vacant, and even today those lands are vacant. Not even a single refugee has been resettled. That has been shown to me by the local kind of revenue officials. They have shown maps that these areas are vacant. So these whole people who were moved from West Bengal to settle in and then they came back to West Bengal. These people were never resettled. So a lot of the whole population is living along railway lines in Calcutta and other cities of India. So a lot of people are kind of landless. And I had interviews with all these different organizations. People have formed small organizations where they're still fighting for permanent settlement. They have got no permanent settlement. They are living along. And when there is a new radio project, they have to relocate. So they are living in camps. So there can be millions of people who are living all across India in camps.
Yeah. Is the Modi government not doing anything for that?
I don't think anybody is doing it.
But he seems to be doing a lot of good stuff for other people, other communities.
I don't know. So there are kind of a lot of landless and landless persons.
Just a small clarification. How did you bring Foucault's knowledge power axis into this?
So what I'm trying to understand is how these technologies of rule work. So there are kind of different strategies of how the state controls its population, right? So that is what I was trying to understand in this project, that how these Zamindars who are in the top of the knowledge production system and how they're controlling their subjects. So that is where I'm kind of looking at the optics of control of our citizens, because people who are the ruling class, they have got that knowledge to govern. So it's a kind of governmental tactics, and the people who are the subjects, they don't have that knowledge to and they have the knowledge to be ruled and not to rule others. So from that perspective, I was looking at.
Okay. And I just needed another clarification. So I didn't quite understand how this economy worked. So how was what I understood the means of production, but how was the circulation through the paper currency and what else?
Okay, so the paper currency that Hamilton introduced was primarily to take people out of the bonded laborers. Like they should not be under the bonded regime. But then the intention of the paper currency was to give money to people who would contribute in public works. Like we have this Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So people who do public work, like for example protecting the embankments. If you don't protect the embankments, you will have problems like what we had in 2009, the ILA circular. Because after independence, the government took responsibility of building all these embankments across the Bay of Bengal. But when Hamilton was in place, his estate gave money. Like they would pay the money, they would print the currency, so the people can use that money to buy food grains. So they will contribute towards protecting embankments. And that was a necessity, because if you don't protect the embankments, you would allow salt water to come into your field. And if you allow salt water to come into your fields, you will not have a productive crop cycle. So it was kind of inbuilt in that idea. That's why if you read that paper currency, that money he has printed for people to build more embankments, to build more protection structures. At the same time, that money can be used to buy food grains.
Buy from where?
No, from the ones, because they will sell it into the cooperative bhandar. They will give the money to the produce to the cooperative bhandar, and the cooperative bhandar would circulate it in other villages.
So you couldn't take this money to Calcutta and buy something from a shop there?
No. It was only for
what I understand is more of like a hamper of present days. Like you present it to the cooperative bank and they can give you it's kind of a hamper or coupon.
Yes.
Coupon, yeah, like that.
It's not a currency at all.
No, he named it as a paper currency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, if I may ask another question, is this? spoke about bringing Lathials from Uttar Pradesh. I'm curious. I mean, this happens in the post-colonial realm, right? As you said.
No, it was happening in the 1930s.
Oh, 1950s.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like why bringing people from UP to as I mean, like Bengal produced its fair share of Lathials and physical culture is at the end of the day, but. Was there any connection between the Zamindaris or the ones who controlled these regions, the middlemen you talk about, who were actually in power, as you say, rather than the cooperative itself? Do you see any connection with these people from the UP? Otherwise, it seems very strange to me that why would you all of a sudden bring in a bunch of people from UP and use them as musclemen just to protect a certain amount of area against the local people?
Yeah. So I interviewed Jang Bahadur Rai, who was the kind of head Lathial, his son. So unfortunately, he just died after my interview, after a few years, because I did the interview in 2016. He died in 2017. So Jang Bahadur Rai's son narrates to me that there were some kind of family connection between these Zamindars, and that is how these Lathials came. And why they came? Because they were very strong and they were very tall. So they could be kind of feared by the community. And as I mentioned, that in the first police post was created in 1960s, and police post could have been created before 1947. So the Zamindars took responsibility of law and order in their estate. And there are several instances when Jang Bahadur Rai's son remembers that where there was huge protest, and people would come to the Kachari Bari and try to kind of burn it down. So Jang Bahadur Rai used to go out and control the whole crowd. So that was the kind of living memory of his son.
But is there also a caste dynamics involved in this?
Yeah, there is.
Bringing in people from a particular caste in the UP.
That is what I meant here. That is what I wanted to kind of highlight. And interestingly, like when the first generation of these people came, their sons and their daughters, they married into the local community. So this person whom I interviewed, his wife was Bengali, and then the descendants would kind of. So there was this kind of cultural. And he said, I have my relatives, and every year I go and visit them, but I find Bengal as my home. So now migration takes shape.
Any other questions? Or any comments, discussion, contribution? I think then we will end here.
Yeah. I just had one last question, comment. Like what I found in those registers, like where the people were kind of enrolled as students, or let's say where this recruitment of teachers took place, that kind of gave the social profile of how the society was composed. So all the teachers who were recruited, or let's say all the apprentices who were used as science lab technicians, or let's say government clerks who joined the state and came from different parts of Bengal, belonged to a particular social strata of society. They were never kind of from the lower strata of society. And that gave a very socially stratified society, which Hamilton, even by bringing this kind of a model, was not in a position to transform. So what I meant is that the people who were the subjects of his project would never get that education to kind of get into that ladder or become a clerk or a school teacher. Even today, like in 2000, when I was in Silver, most of the teachers in the schools were either coming from Calcutta, whoever was settled in the villages, were belonging to a particular caste category, and they were writing books on Bengali. And that itself had in those hierarchies, those books written in Bengali, carried those sentiments. Like for example, they will start writing their book that initially they were only kind of people who were pagan believers in these islands, and then because of the influence of Hinduism and Buddhism, they converted to Hinduism, and then the whole process starts. So it's like how the colonials had kind of described the genealogy tree. Like the tribe should be at the bottom, and at the top will be the peasantry, and people who lives in the plain. So that hierarchy was still maintained.